Okay, so welcome everyone. Welcome to the very first special interest group SEFI at Work webinar organized by the Gender and Diversity. So we hope this will be the first of many, and we thought that this would be the most important topic to discuss in this event. So the role of mental health for a diverse and inclusive engineering culture. We have 3 speakers with us today that will present very shortly. But in the meantime, I'll pass over to Natalie to talk about why we decided to do this event today.
Thank you. Hi, my name is Natalie. So thank you all for coming. I guess we all know that in recent years there's been growing concerns around the mental health of our students, particularly in light of COVID-19. And as a SIG, I think we realised that mental health and issues of diversity and inclusion are closely connected, and that engineering students from different diverse backgrounds can face, issues with lack of representation, bias, and microaggressions that can impact their mental health, their sense of belonging, and also that some of the initiatives we can use to support diversity and inclusion and belonging can also support mental health and vice versa. So we also recognise that some of the sort of factors associated with engineering culture can be detrimental to students. So for example, in 2019, Equal Engineers UK found that engineers attributed poor mental health to cultural issues within engineering. We also recognise that engineering degrees can be considered to be challenging and competitive, and that there's often a lot of stress and struggle associated with doing an engineering degree. And so I guess we wanted to run this event with World Mental Health Day coming up, so that we could bring together a community of people who are interested in this topic, and we could reflect upon some of the issues faced by students who study engineering. So yeah, I guess I'll hand over back to Ines to introduce the first speaker.
All right, so we start our first presentation by Karen Jensen, and I'll introduce her very quickly. So Karen is, Dr. Karen Jensen is a teaching assistant professor in bioengineering at University of Illinois Urbana-Champaign. Her research interests include student mental health and wellness, engineering student career pathways, and engagement of engineering faculty in engineering education research. She was awarded a Career Award in 2019 from the National Science Foundation for her research on undergraduate mental health in engineering programs. She is also a member at large of the ASEE Commission on Diversity, Equity and Inclusion, and is currently an associate editor for the Journal of Women and Minorities in Science and Engineering. So before joining Illinois Urbana-Champaign University, she completed a postdoctoral fellowship in bioinformatics at Sanofi Oncology in Cambridge, and she earned a bachelor's degree in biological engineering from Cornell University and a PhD in biomedical engineering from the University of Virginia. Karen, thank you so much for your time today. We're delighted to have you here and listen about and learn with you about your research projects and your extensive experience in mental health and with engineering students. Thank you so much. And I'll stop sharing right now so you can share your screen.
Okay, well, first, I'd like to thank the organizers for this opportunity to participate in this really important discussion today, and also to thank all of you who are here for participating in this conversation. So today I want to talk about mental health in engineering culture and how we might start to change that narrative in engineering from one of suffering and hardship to one of wellness and thriving. Natalie addressed this topic, but as I know all of you in this room know that higher education has been facing an unprecedented mental health crisis. We've seen increasing prevalence and severity of mental health disorders for college students. And in addition to increasing diagnoses, concerningly, we see in some data an increase in suicidal ideation of students has also been measured. So this increase in prevalence and in diagnosis has also increased the demand for mental health services on our college campuses. So in surveys and interviews that we've conducted with students, a common complaint that we see is the lack of access for appointments on campus. So students talk about, getting up at really early hours, trying to get into the system to get an appointment, or having to wait weeks for appointments, or maybe being limited to a number of visits, with some students reporting that these experiences that they or their peers have been discouraging them from seeking help when they do need it because of this lack of access. And another thing we know, also Natalie mentioned, that we know that from research that the help-seeking behaviors of students for mental health concerns varies by social identity. So for example, first-generation students, non-white students, and also first-year students have all been shown in studies to have higher stigma and maybe perceive higher barriers when thinking about seeking help for a mental health concern. So the result of this is, what we know is that many of our students are not getting the help that they need for mental health concerns. So of course, as what's been said, and as all of us have experienced in the last year and a half or so, the COVID-19 pandemic has absolutely added new stressors, but also exacerbated other stressors. So we know from research that particularly students from lower socioeconomic groups, this was particularly challenging with online learning, and lack of stable internet access was a problem. And we see that in some early work, 83% of students indicated that COVID-19 worsened pre-existing mental health conditions. And that almost a third of students said that this impaired their academic work. So thinking about, not only are students experiencing this, but thinking about how it's impacting their academics and how we can best support them. And some early work specifically in engineering has shown an increase in depressive disorders for our students. So of course, the totality and these long-term consequences of this mental health toll on our undergraduates is still unknown, but it could prove to be quite substantial, and particularly for some more vulnerable groups. So as a result, there's a rising concern that the COVID-19 pandemic is exacerbating as well as creating new educational inequities that might reverberate for years after the end of the pandemic. So there hasn't been as much studies that have focused specifically on the mental health of engineering students, but some studies have shown that in some cases that engineering students may be more likely to experience depression and anxiety disorders, for example, compared to other populations. Other studies have shown this in college students, that compared to their peers, engineering students may be more likely to experience mental health concerns. Simultaneously, we also see in some data that engineering students may be less likely to seek help compared to their peers in other academic disciplines. So again, thinking about how this is impacting specifically our engineering students, and maybe what types of interventions we need to be thinking about in our educational programs for engineering students. So in a recent study that our group conducted before the COVID-19 pandemic, we found that nearly a third of engineering students were experiencing moderate to extremely severe levels of stress, anxiety, and depression. Of course, this was before the pandemic, and we know from some early data that's been coming in that this has been worsened during the pandemic, particularly for depression. So the aspect of our work in mental health that I'd like to talk about today is the role of engineering culture. So this was something really striking to me. So I came back to academia from working in industry, and it was really striking to me about how mental health was discussed in our education programs, which is what really got me interested in these topics to start with. So for example, when it was my first semester teaching, and I was talking to a student, and he was telling me how terrible stress is for him and his peers. And I asked him about it, and he said, well, that's just part of who we are as engineering students. We're crazy stressed all the time. That's just how it is. So this really got me thinking about culture of engineering programs, right? Our expectations and our norms, and how that changes our behavior. So culture, of course, is also how we describe ourselves, like the students saying, oh, that's just how engineering students are. We're crazy stressed. So my students like memes, right? So this meme of how we describe ourselves, right? Engineers, when other people think of Taylor, they think of Taylor Swift, but we engineers, right, we think of the Taylor series. And one of my favorite descriptions of culture is the writer David Foster Wallace describes culture and about these two fish that are swimming, right? And the one fish says to the other fish, oh, how's the water today? And the other fish says, what's water, right? So this idea that culture is something we're completely immersed in, and we don't always recognize it, right? It's just there, and it permeates everything, and we don't necessarily recognize it or realize how it maybe is impacting our actions and what we perceive as norms. But that's also what makes culture so powerful, right? Is that these perceptions that we hold about what is normal are very powerful influences on how we respond to something and how we behave, even if we're not really realizing it. So I think that's why it's really important to talk about the engineering culture and what's the role of mental health in engineering culture, and how these norms and expectations may be influencing behavior, especially when we start to think about what are the interventions that we need to best support our students. So why the role of mental health in engineering culture has not been explored to a great extent, but there has been some work looking at the culture of engineering programs that might give us some ideas about how the role of mental health. So engineering has been called a meritocracy of difficulty, one of suffering and shared hardship, or a boot camp mentality, narratives of students who are not cut out for engineering, and workloads being described as horrific is how engineering has been described. And so, of course, there's lots of ways to communicate cultural norms. As I mentioned, my students love memes, so I asked them to share with me some memes about being an engineering student. So this was one I got several times, right? This is a comedy called The Office, and the characters choose two: enough sleep, grades, or social life. False, choose one. I said this was described them as engineering students. Or this other one about this idea that, oh, the faculty are all getting together and let's make the final so hard that nobody can pass. So these were memes that students shared about what they felt like it was like to be an engineering student. So to better understand how engineering students experience the role of mental health in engineering culture, we've conducted several mixed method studies that looked at, aimed to characterize the engineering student experience with mental health. And these are some of the themes that we found in our study, and I'll touch on them a little bit more in a few minutes. The first was that stress is normal and necessary. So a lot of our students talked about how that was an expectation, or mental health being poor is necessary for engineering. When we looked at help-seeking behaviors of engineering students compared to other students, we found that there was more reliance on their peers as a coping mechanism for mental health. And then also we looked at the barriers that they experience and also perceive to seeking help for mental health concerns. And we saw things like physical barriers as far as the access to the counseling center that I mentioned earlier. Either it's too far away or they can't get an appointment. Things like informational barriers. These were things like students saying, well, you tell me all these things about mental health my first day on campus, but then it's 2 years later, I don't remember, I don't have easy access to this information. There's too much information, I can't find what I need. And then the third barrier being a cultural barrier, which we'll talk about in a few moments, and how that was impacting students' willingness to seek help for a mental health concern. So as I mentioned, that one of the first things that we saw was in our studies with engineering students, that students characterize engineering as a discipline with its expectation of very high stress and even stress glorification, right? So students talking about, oh, you're a great engineering student because you pulled 3 all-nighters this week, this glorification of stress and poor self-care. So students talked about stress being part of the package, or just that it was necessary, or that they had to suffer poor mental health to get through an engineering program, and that was normal. They talked about health not being a priority in engineering, that the academic success being a priority over health, and that was something that they felt was pervasive in engineering culture. And other students sharing that they felt that poor mental health was an expectation, and that's part of being an engineer. So relatedly, because of this expectation of stress being normal, we actually found that the belief that stress was the norm was one of the most commonly cited reasons for students not to seek treatment for mental health disorders, is that because they felt it was so normal and that expected, that why should they get treatment? So this was actually the number one barrier we saw in our sample for not seeking help. So instead, students indicated a very heavy reliance on their peers. So we know in studies of engineering culture, so the Godfrey Parker, for example, studies from a few years back that looked at the dimensions of engineering culture, they describe a reliance on peers for academic success. So we also saw this to be true for mental health, is that students talked quite a bit about, well, only my peers truly understand, because being an engineering student is this unique experience. Only my peers understand. The counselors don't understand, they would tell us. So I'm going to rely on my peers. So instead, even when they recognized they were having a mental health challenge, instead of going to seek professional help, they would have this reliance on their peers, just as they do with their academics. And so then the last thing just to share quickly is I mentioned these cultural barriers. So a lot of students, again, this is just an example quote from a student, again, talking about how stress is part of the package. So that why should I seek help, right? This is expected. It was what I signed up for, even as being an engineering student. It's very common. Why am I any different? Why should I seek help? So students feeling that because of it, it was so normal, why did they deserve to seek help over other students, which we thought was a very concerning barrier that a lot of students felt as an engineering student. So what can we do about this? So if the culture of engineering is one of high stress or even stress glorification and poor self-care, how can we start to change this narrative? So one question I'm often asked about engineering culture and this idea of a culture of high stress and stress glorification is, well, who's creating this culture? Why is this happening in engineering? And my answer is that we're all contributing to it, whether or not we realize it or not. But the good thing about that, right, is that means that we can all change it. So I want to share with you quickly some of the work we've done on some interventions that support student mental health. So the first idea is classroom wellness activities. So these can be things like short stretch breaks in your class, maybe mindfulness. This is something we've done at the University of Illinois, is to integrate mindfulness into our classes. So I recently trained as a mindfulness instructor, but you can also use recordings. So we did, for our classes, we have like a 3-minute mindfulness recording after class, or this could be during a break with a longer class. We also do pre-exam mindfulness sessions for interested students. And again, usually we use recordings, so an instructor doesn't need to be trained to do these. And we found that we thought that students wouldn't be as receptive as they were, that the majority of students were very appreciative. And this is something we started during the COVID-19 pandemic, when we were all online, and giving students these opportunities and to remind them that we as instructors cared about their wellness. So even though it's a very small gesture, but to let them know that, to remind them to take care of their wellness and that we cared about their wellness, that we were making these efforts. These can also be things like integrating wellness into the curriculum. So a lot of times, we don't think of wellness as being part of engineering, but there's ways we can integrate learning about wellness into our engineering curriculum. So in another project with my collaborator, Holly Galecki, here at the University of Illinois, we've developed a design project for engineering students using biometric stress trackers that measure physiology, things like skin conductance, and created a engineering design project with it. So students could learn about wellness, but also learn about engineering design, and took advantage of this, right, to teach more aspects of wellness and partner with our colleagues in psychology and other departments to teach the students about wellness in the context of this design project. This can also be things like syllabus statements. These syllabus statements can acknowledge student mental health as a priority to you as an instructor, and also provide resources to students. So your university might have a template, or you could write your own. But students in our studies have said that just that having a syllabus statement, that acknowledgement from an instructor, meant a lot to the student, and also meant that they would be more comfortable approaching the instructor about a mental health concern, because that instructor has signaled that this is a priority to the instructor. So of course, providing resources. So this might be in sharing information in your class or on your website, or making announcements in your class about mental health and wellness resources, and helping to normalize use of these resources. So if they hear it in class, an engineering class, that helps to normalize the fact that engineering students do use these resources, and that it's okay to use these resources. Also modeling self-care. So I mentioned that, right, we all contribute to this engineering culture. And of course, as faculty, and I know I'm guilty of it, we often talk about all the deadlines or emails, right? They pile up. And but also, so how are we communicating these norms about self-care to our students, right? It is that as they might look to us and in our behavior and defining what the field of engineering is. So something I used to do when I was a new instructor is I always thought I needed to answer student emails immediately, like at every hour of the day, over the weekend, at night. And I thought that was being a good instructor. And then, doing more of these studies with students and where they get these perceptions about high stress in engineering, realizing that I was actually not doing them any favors, right? That I was modeling poor self-care to them, and giving them an expectation, if I'm always available on my email to talk to you, that they should always be on their email. And we know that constant connectivity to our social media, email, everything else is detrimental to our mental health. So thinking about how some of these subtle signaling things we do for students can help better model self-care, or even talking about how we prioritize our own self-care to our students. Also our language. So in a separate study, we found that, as I'm sure we all know, but an overuse of the word stress to describe anything from some traffic on my way to campus to severe illness. And that a lot of students, they use this term so much, and, the students would tell us, like, I don't even know what I mean anymore. It's so normal, but yet I still don't know what I'm talking about. And realizing that, that's actually detrimental for recognizing students who are in distress and who need help. And especially with their peers, right? They're relying on their peers for help. And if they're talking about this extreme language about stress all the time, how do we know who needs professional help versus who's communicating it in that way? So really thinking about the language we're using in how we talk about mental health and stress, and how students talk about it with each other, and then identify their peers who do need help. And then finally, the last thing would be thinking about how we can support community. So we know from research that social interactions are important for supporting mental health. So thinking about how we can increase these interactions, student-student interactions, faculty-student interactions in our own classes, which of course is even more critical in this age of COVID-19 when so many of us are in virtual learning. So this could be things like thinking about how to have more informal interactions with your students, even if it's just coming to class earlier, staying there later, just giving students an opportunity to have more interactions and create community in your class. So in summary, I'd just like to leave you with these 3 reflection questions. And the first is, how can we dismantle this idea that being stressed out is the norm in engineering and that it's necessary for success? The second, and thinking about how are we subtly even communicating these norms about mental health and self-care to our students? And finally, how might instead supporting a culture of wellness and building this culture of wellness support our broadening participation efforts? And so with that, I'd like to thank the support from the National Science Foundation, as well as my fantastic group members, who most of which are pictured here, who are very passionate about mental health and engineering. And it's just a real pleasure to work with them. And I would be happy to answer any questions. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Karen. Really interesting. I really like the advice at the end. Language is one thing I've been talking with a colleague about at the moment. I think a lot of the language is normalized, so it's a really interesting point. I'll open the floor to questions if anyone wants to raise their hand, or just unmute or write a question in the chat. That's all fine. Yeah, go ahead.
I would have a question about the the cultural part of the stress syndrome. Yes. Especially because in Europe there are different cultures. It might work differently, but maybe you have more ideas and you have more information about that.
Yeah, I think that's a great point. I know I have talked to a colleague in Europe about doing some comparative type studies to understand. Of course, all of the data, I will say all the data I did share was with US students, and there absolutely could be some differences there. Of course, we know that there's also, for a lot of our international students, we see some different things in the data in our US campus. So I think that's absolutely a very good point. I don't think we really have the answer to that yet, but I do think it's a very important future direction to be thinking about, you know, how is engineering culture different, and what can we learn and from other campuses to do differently, and to create a more supportive environment for our students. I think it's a great point, but unfortunately, I don't fully have the answer for you. As I said, most of our work has been done with US students, but I do think that's an important future step to look at.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you.
So I think if anyone's got any more questions, maybe we can put them in the chat in the interest of time for now. Thank you, Karen.
Thank you.
Okay, so I can introduce now the second speaker of today's session, Isabel Goncalves. She's a specialist psychologist in clinical and health psychology and also in educational psychology. She holds the advanced specialties of psychotherapy and psychological counseling, certified by the Portuguese Psychologists Association. She was a founding member of the Professional Association Network of Psychological Counseling Services in Higher Education, and implemented and coordinated the service, the psychological support service at Instituto Superior Técnico, which is the largest engineering institution in Portugal. Since 2005, she coordinates and she founded and coordinates the Academic Development Office at Instituto Superior Técnico, that was before called Tutoring Support Office. She also implemented and coordinated the psychological support service between 1993 and 2006, so a wide experience in supporting engineering students. Isabel, it's a pleasure to have you here today. The Zoom floor is yours.
Okay, thank you. I want to thank the organization, Inês and Natalie, for inviting me. And I also would like to thank the participants and my colleagues who are also doing the presentations. And I especially thank Karen for a previous presentation. It was really interesting. So I'm now going to share my experience. It's an honor to be here with very good researchers specific in this area. I'm not a researcher, so I'm going to mainly share my practice and the things that we have developed at IST through the years. So I hope we can have a good discussion on what we have been trying to do here. I would like to ask you, not when I am showing the PowerPoint, to identify yourselves. Most of you already have, but some of you it's difficult to understand the name. And I want to remind everybody that the session is being recorded. So my team here at the Academic Development Office, it's 7 of us. And we have 4 educational psychologists, but the rest are from different backgrounds. And we have been doing this work for more or less 17 years. So I'm going to share with you what we have done in these 17 years. And Inês was saying, and it is true, I've worked for 10 years more or less in the counseling and psychotherapy support here in IST, but then I started working, developing a tutoring program, and then we developed into this Academic Development Office. So I'm going to try to explain what we do. Maybe this is a good way to start. So we work both with professors and students. I think this is something that I find is really relevant, since a lot of work, either considering mental health and the community practices, usually are more targeted at students and not so much at teachers. So we try to get everybody involved in these activities. They are not specifically directed at counseling students, although we do some coaching. You can read it here, coaching for students. We do some academic coaching for students, a bachelor degree, master's degree, and even doctoral students. And this coaching that we do is a development practice for students to both increase the quality of their studies and the results, but also their mental health. So, but we don't do specifically psychotherapy or anything like that, because the service we had and that I coordinated for 10 years still exists. I'm not there, but it still exists. Another thing that we do is we do soft skills training for students and teachers. One area that I believe is relevant is that we do a lot of work on emotional intelligence skills training. We do that for teachers, and we do that for students as well. In fact, in some bachelor degree programs, my team goes to the classes with the first year teachers and the first year students, and we do workshops included in the syllabus that train team building skills, oral presentation skills, time management skills, and other sorts of skills that are connected with emotional intelligence. And we do workshops for teachers. For instance, we do a coaching for the dissertation or coaching for supervisors, so that they can use the coaching methodologies to support their students. And they have been, it's kind of surprising, because in the beginning teachers did not believe this was an important opportunity, but gradually they have been understanding the relevance of doing this, and they are enrolling in every year within higher numbers of participants. We also have this special workshop for high achievers, especially we train high achievers from all levels at IST in emotional intelligence skills. And this is a very popular program for students. We also work with the connection in between professors and students through the tutorial program. So every student from the first year, bachelor, and now also master's students degree, have a tutor. And so tutors are from the course from the program where the student has enrolled, and they do some coaching and tutorial activities for the students. So lastly, we also have built a program for newcomers, for new teachers, for new faculty. And this program, which is more complex, and I can answer any questions you have regarding this, but it includes the observation of classes and the feedback on how to improve classes. I think the main thing is concerning the mental health, that's what we are talking here. I think the main thing is lots of teachers, big tutors or just regular teachers or new faculty, they have a connection with us. And so they all work as a big network of identification and referencing for the academic development office. And if we feel the problem has more to do with mental health specifically, we can send them over to the psychological service that we have. So this is what I really wanted to share. I'm going to just talk about some more initiatives, especially those that we have developed during this year of the pandemic. But all of this structure was already working before the pandemic, and it was really useful during the pandemic. For instance, one idea, teachers found it very interesting and used the doubts classes, online doubts classes, and the students seemed to appreciate that very much and participated even more than face-to-face doubts classes, which was kind of surprising. I also think that I could repeat the data that was presented before, and I'm going to speak very briefly so that I don't repeat, but I think that it's very relevant to also think that this is the sort of a sort of perfect storm, because our students who are now enrolling the university are belong to the generation, to a generation that has already lived with computers. And there's a lot to be said about this timing, because some students were more comfortable with remote interactions than face-to-face. And to some students, they really enjoyed these remote classes, which again opens a big discussion in our school. But I think the main thing is, yes, I think the culture in engineering really is, I can connect with the former presenter. And I could say that the culture in IST could be defined just the same way as it was defined by Karen. And I've been working with MIT, with an MIT team, and they say exactly the same. So it seems to be a more general thing on what the way we live engineering culture. But on the other hand, I believe that the situation in our world really puts a very big stress and complexity to the engineering in general. And this is not a built up stress. I think it's got to do a lot with the way the world has evolved and the way it has increased its complexity, its uncertainty, its volatility, and its ambiguity. And so it's difficult to deal with all this information. I also think, probably you do too, that the COVID-19 just increased this a lot more. So what can we do? We can see, and this is again data that are very much in line with what Karen said, there's a a growing percentage of students with severe psychological problems. I've just known, and it was kind of surprising to me, but at MIT, they have just now formed a task force just for students who have been hospitalized due to mental health problems, and they help the students to again try to adapt to the university. So how do these students feel? Well, at least from our experience, they feel very much a great need of resiliency. Since the gratification is delayed, they have to work very hard to have results. Many times they have this imposter syndrome, just like I don't belong here. And obviously this is reinforced by the idea that Karen was speaking about, that you just, here we say, drop them into the water. If they swim, it's okay. If they fell down, it's okay, just the same, they don't belong here. And this obviously is it creates not stress. I don't believe this is stress. I think this is much worse than stress. It's a culture that builds mental health problems actively. Stress and anxiety are also feelings of loneliness, very much increased during the pandemic. Difficulty in time management due to the the great amount of tasks the students have. They also have to deal with a lot of uncertainty, and very frequently they also have this perfectionism supported by the school. I remember we had this workshop for physics and math students, and we were giving a workshop over there regarding emotional intelligence, and we were going to speak about perfectionism, and the teacher said, no, we want them to be perfectionistic. And we had a big discussion, and he really understood that we don't want students to be perfectionistic. We want them to be rigorous, which is quite a different thing. The problems of balancing the professional and personal needs in life, and in most severe cases, not only depression, but also burnout. I believe this is OMS has been talking and raising awareness regarding burnout, and I think this is really serious and we should pay attention. I'm not going to elaborate on that, but we have also run a study on psychosocial risks at IST, but we did not involve just yet the students and the professors, just the staff, and the results are really interesting, and we are building on a different, well, one of the things that we are building is a culture code applied to all the school to try to prevent some of these problems. We have collaboration with a psychology department at the University of Lisboa to do that. Okay, so just to start finishing because of the time, we know that mental health for engineers is difficult many times. I have some data here, and especially I believe, and we have, well, Karen has told something about that, that the masculinity culture sometimes is rewards some of these behaviors. I must tell you, we had these, during the pandemics, we had this club of students dedicated to mental health, and they've built these workshops done by themselves and with some people invited from outside, and they called them brainstorms. And at some point we were seeing that mostly girls went there not boys, and so we decided to do a workshop on toxic masculinity, and it was the most popular of the workshops, and many students share their experience on how difficult it is to live in this engineering / masculinity culture. I have some data here. 1 in 4 engineers believe society expects them to be macho. Less than a quarter of engineers would feel comfortable discussing their challenges, battling this depression or financial stress. And last and most sad, 1 in 5 engineers said they had lost a work colleague to suicide. I also can share an activity that we had last year with the physics department students, and they were sharing in a group, online group. It was very moving because they were sharing how difficult it is, and how to build a community where they can help each other is one of the answers possible for this very difficult experience sometimes. So just to some ideas that I really believe are worth sharing. I think it's relevant to develop a growth mindset in students and teachers and in higher education culture at large, that is to improve practicing and making mistakes as part of learning and growing, to encourage the sharing of difficulties and help seeking in the community, not only in students, but in general, to encourage, for instance, by modeling self-care practices in students and teachers, to receive new students and improve the quality of their experience at university, to promote emotional intelligence of students and teachers, and to offer mental health emergency care for all. And I believe, to have everybody in the school to be aware of the services that can help students. So for now, this is it. Thank you very much. I'm going to stop my sharing.
Thank you, Isabel. Really interesting talk. I think it's quite overwhelming, really. The data is quite staggering and scary. I think a really interesting point as well. I think as a SIG, we obviously had a sort of focus on minorities, but I think it's equally as important to recognize that a majority of engineers might be white men, and they also have issues with bringing forward mental health issues. So I think that was a really interesting point for me. I'll just open up the floor to questions. So again, feel free to ask questions in the chat, or put your hand up, or just speak.
Isabel, I was wondering if you could just say a few words about the cultural code that you're preparing at the IST. What sort of messages do you really want to be strong in that code?
We are just in the very beginning of that. We have a code of ethics, of course, from the University of Lisboa, but we now found out, and I see there are some questions here regarding industry and I would say companies that hire engineers, and at least one company that hires a lot of engineers worldwide and here in Portugal as well is OutSystems, a Portuguese brand organization, and they have this code of culture that is a more practical thing that states that with very nice examples and a very good design, very clear on how we should apply for help every time we have a problem with something, and on how different ideas and creativity is encouraged, even if it leads to mistakes, and also to improve critical thinking and to have people give feedback on what's happening. So the general idea is to try to build from there, and also from the practices that we found out that were not very useful, and to try to build this code of culture or culture book, if you want, in order to try to change the culture a bit. But the thing, as you probably all know, it will have to come, and it is coming from the management of the school. So the school management is going to align this culture code with the values of the institution. So we are just starting, but we also have the expertise of the Faculty of Psychology to help us doing that. And obviously it will have to actively involve everybody in the school.
Thank you very much, Isabel. Conscious about time, so we need to move to our last speaker. Natalie will introduce.
Yeah, so our final speaker is Joanne Tate. She's an academic strategic lead for teaching, learning and enhancement in the School of Engineering at Robert Gordon University. So she's interested in mental well-being of engineering students and is currently conducting a PhD in the topic, which involves systematic scoping review, surveys and interviews looking at engineering students' mental health and well-being. So I'll hand over. Thank you very much.
Thank you. I just need to do my little check of what you can actually see. Are you able to see the posh slides or my note slides?
Lovely. We can see lovely slides with no notes.
Super. I get very nervous at these things, so I think it's always handy if I have notes aside to me just in case. So first of all, I'm just really grateful that people are willing to listen to me in my early stages of my research. I'm going to take you through a little bit of what I am doing and why I'm doing it, just to contextualize it a little bit. I would preface this with that while I'm an old lady now, I am actually a PhD candidate and not a massive expert just yet, although I am working on it. So I work at the Robert Gordon School of Engineering in Aberdeen, and I've been teaching engineers for about 20 years. I have a geology background, but I'm very interested in making sure our students and graduates are fit for the future that may behold them. So why am I looking at this? On the left-hand side of my screen here, I have some general stats about UK student experience and mental health. So this is before and during COVID-19, some of these statistics or facts and figures that I've put up there. In particular, COVID has had a negative effect, but also that over half students in the UK have declared a mental health issue or illness. On the right-hand side are statistics or facts and figures relating to engineering students from papers across the globe. And I do have some issues around the descriptions of, or the definitions of, what mental health is, what a mental illness is, and what mental well-being is. At the moment, I'm going with a coverall of mental health and well-being, just to make sure we've covered everything. But it does look like there's an increased risk of serious mental illness and very serious mental health symptoms or mental ill health symptoms expressing themselves through our engineering students. So for me, when I was looking at this, I'm getting a bit of a fright and thinking, oh crikey, everything's terrible, what are we going to do? So in order to do that, I embarked upon my PhD, which at high level involves a systematic scoping review of existing literature in mental health and well-being, a survey to understand and establish and map the mental well-being of UK engineering students, and interview. And I've actually carried out all of this work now. I'm hoping at some point I'll be able to analyse it. The systematic scoping review that I did was to investigate the types of interventions that people had conducted in the engineering student population. And that's quite a specific thing to ask, because the literature that I had found either tangentially refer to things or kind of mentioned that it was stressful or talked about particular things around the culture, but there was actually very few things that I could find where someone had done a thing and then measured it at the end. So in order to try and map out what's been happening, I conducted this systematic scoping review. I don't know if that's a familiar methodology for anyone. Essentially, it's used in health sciences in the UK to map key concepts underpinning a research area and to look at the main sources and types of evidence available. In order to do that, you design and follow a scoping protocol so that others can replicate the search. So as we can see here, there were 14 studies worldwide on this topic of interventions. All of them were different from each other. I would caveat that this was carried out primarily during COVID and just slightly before. I do know that there are some newer intervention studies that have been published, and I've tried to capture that a little bit later on. But this, if you imagine, as of Jan 20, this is what we have as a state of play. The amount of students that have been intervened on was around 2,700, predominantly male engineering students, and they were involved in studies from universities in America, Canada, India, Spain, China, Malaysia, Mexico, and Turkey. So there's quite a broad coverage there. Nothing in the UK, and as we mentioned before, not so much in Europe either. Well, there is Spain and Turkey there, but I think we need a little bit more. All of these studies were identifying that there were issues with mental health, mental distress, mental illness. They were phrased in different ways, but they were kind of coming at it from the same thing. Most of the common interventions there, as I mentioned, is training and relaxation, as well as the use of technology as well to perhaps make learning easier. most of the interventions were focusing on mindfulness techniques to try and improve the feelings of state anxiety. They did seem to be reasonably successful, and as Karen had mentioned, people do seem to be quite receptive to mindfulness training, which is not my experience in my own school, but I see it elsewhere. In terms of outcomes being reported, the interventions did note that there was stress reduction and some improvement of academic achievement, which did seem to be a thing that many of the papers were keen to press, and also around the communication confidence as well they were looking at. To try and break this down a bit for everybody, the main points of the interventions, and this is in my view, were either curricular, as in focusing on the introduction of a course, a week-long break, or a service, or to improve things, or in-school personal support. There were interventions focused on the personal, as in really focused on the student, their breathing exercises, affirmation work, metacognition studies, and then there were slightly fewer interventions focused on teaching approach, i.e. using peer-led classes, gamification, or the use of apps in lessons to try to make things perhaps less stressful to learn. The types of outcome measure that have been that I noticed or that I found, there were some physiological ones there, and someone had mentioned about skin conductivity. So there have been some studies based on trying to reduce stress through breathing exercises, and they measured it through skin conductivity, blood pressure, and for the week long, the ones who they looked at a week off for students looked at saliva samples to look at enzymes. I still can't pretend to understand what they actually were doing there, but it did look like they got some results out of it. We also had two different types of survey. I've split them this way. One set of surveys were focusing on the personal, so perceived stress, anxiety scales, anxiety questionnaires, health promotion, and then other surveys were really focusing on academic performance and learning anxiety, cognitive load. And then finally, there were some other measurements which were analysing journals and discussions and notes. So it's a big mix, is basically what I'm trying to get at. So with that, I wasn't able to synthesize anything really from what was there. Everyone's done some great work, but it's on small populations and they're not using the same measurements. So it's not really, we can't really say you got to do this mindfulness technique because that's the one that works. It's impossible to do it that way. So in order to get my own data, I put together a survey of UK engineering students, and just a long story short, essentially it discovered that of that there was a higher prevalence of mental illnesses within the respondents. There was significantly poorer mental well-being. This is using the Warwick Edinburgh Mental Wellbeing Scale, which has been, I can't now forgotten the word, which has been proved for general population of UK and has been used in Scotland as a measure. And it was even worse for female students. These were statistically significant when I did some sums. Over half of them said that they would not reach out to an engineering staff member if feeling low. They did prefer friends and family. They felt that staff were not approachable. And the main one was they either didn't know who to ask or they were afraid of being judged going forward if they mentioned that they had a problem. In terms of promoting behaviour, well-being promoting behaviour, one of the things that came out of the survey was that those who seemed to be doing the wellest or who had the best mental well-being had excellent time management and planning skills, and this seemed to see them through better than those who had poorer organisational skills, and that actually fed through into my interviews as well. So it kind of points towards that, yes, there's this huge workload, but if you've got that time management thing down, the stress is less. The better you prepare, the more lucky you are, that kind of thing. But there's definitely something there I think is worthy of further investigation. I asked them if they would speak to anyone, and if they would or would not, why would that be? What they came back with, and that's a direct quote from some of the responses, were engineers, we don't talk about feelings. They either didn't know what they were supposed to say, they felt it was risky, they didn't want their lecturers to look at them differently. The worst ones, and they came out a lot, was they do not care. I've tried before, they don't care, they ignored me, I felt worse. These are fairly damning indictments. I do understand that as a survey tool, people who are less happy are more likely to have filled in the form. There were quite a lot of people who had excellent well-being. They still wouldn't want to share with a member of staff about how they were feeling, and that worried me in terms of their help seeking. I did ask them more positively, what would you say to a new engineering student? And obviously, because everyone's a joker, there was a few fun ones in there, like don't do engineering. So I was like, thanks very much for that. But in terms of something slightly more useful, they talked a lot about letting perfectionism go. There's that perfectionism theme was coming through this, learning that failure is actually all right. There is some of that engineering culture, you'll see there, Karen, peeking in around recognizing this is really hard. The workload will make you feel like well-being and good grades are mutually exclusive. Don't feel guilty. These are all wonderful things to say, but for me, there's not actually anything hugely practical in that for the students. So it's nice that they're saying that and they're encouraging people. But I think what we need to help students with is some sort of, if you forgive the term, toolkit to help students actually through the journey, while at the same time fixing the culture that they're in. It's very difficult to do all of the things in one go, obviously. But this is what came back from my survey anyway. 91 of the comments, it was over 300 comments from the students, and 91 of them related to time management. So that came through again. In terms of some key takeaways, I'll tell you, fire through this. It does look like UK engineering students are at higher risk of poor mental well-being and also potentially experience poor mental health in greater numbers. And I separate those two because having poor mental well-being and being stressed in the moment is not an illness. And I think one of the things that we need to establish in our own circle is what is poor well-being, what is an actual illness, and what is poor mental health, and where those lines are for everyone. Thing is, no one has the absolute answer for this. So that will be, I guess, a subject of further discussion some other time. I do feel that this is contributing to the attrition of graduates and that leaky pipeline that we are always talking about. I don't think this is helping anybody. In terms of things we can do, there's a lovely conciliatory useless comment about helping our departments to encourage openness. That's probably not as easy as that sounds, but my main thing, if I was going to take away anything, is get staff mental health first aid training. It doesn't turn you into a counsellor. It doesn't mean that you're suddenly a psychologist and you can fix everyone's problems, but it does mean that you are able to set out your own boundaries. You can identify when someone needs to go somewhere for some help. You're essentially a first aider. It's the same thing. You're not going to become a top surgeon, but you will be able to stick a plaster on and send them off to the doctor. And at the very least, be able to know where you're signposting. Every university has some form of student support. And if you know where that is and you can direct them there, that is really a very helpful thing to do. And you might have noticed through my slight comments around about the differences in outcome measures and reporting guidelines. I think we do need to do further robust research. It's not that these studies were not robust, it's just that because they've used so many different measurements and assumptions, it is very difficult to come out with any sort of clear direction in terms of interventions going forward. So it's just some discussion points here. These were for me really, but what do people feel the barriers to improve in mental health and well-being in engineering education and beyond? That's a very long sentence. So what do we think the barriers are? How are we supposed to fix this? I have actually listed all the interventions in a separate slide. I'm happy to share that. What interventions are interesting to people. My real question for everyone is industry ready for Engineer 4.0? We go on about engineering 4.0 or industry 4.0, but if we develop our students to be emotionally intelligent, have their boundaries to be you know, an enhanced engineer, if you will. I feel terrible for saying it, but if we put them into industry and industry has not changed, are we then doing them a disservice? And that worries me a lot. And just a bit of self-promotion there. I am currently doing a pilot on tailored support for engineering students. So if anyone's interested to see what I am doing on that front, or perhaps wants to collaborate in the future, please let me know. And because Karen had a meme, I have to have a meme also. Last year, our university decided that all the exams should be in 1 week because many of the other schools don't have exams and it's inconvenient for them. And so just to prove a bit of engineering culture, that's my, that's it for me. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Joanne. It was really fascinating to see the results of your survey, and quite shocking to see so very few interventions on how to address anxiety and depression in students. And I really like the point that you've mentioned. It's really dear to me and a few colleagues that are here today, is this idea that engineering is purely rational, right? There's no space to discuss emotions, reflect on our well-being. And what's the value of teaching our students about global responsibility, health and safety, if we don't allow them to have this safe space to be themselves and feel welcome and feel safe? So I think that's a really good point you've made there. Any quick questions for Joanne before we break out for some small group discussion around all these wonderful things that we've listened today?
I have a question, if I may.
Martin, hi.
Hi, I don't know how the sound is, but I'm sitting in a public space. And my question is twofold. Is what we're talking about mental health and well-being or wellness, is it a specific engineering student issue, or is it a general issue with students of higher education? And my second question is, we talk about the hazards, the pathological aspects of well-being, but if we just regard the word health, you can be healthy and you can be healthier, you can be strong, you can be ill. So if you're not well, you are ill, but then you can get cured. But there's a scale on wealth, on how strong or how wealthy you are, and from wealthy to being super wealthy, according or along a mental health scale. Why don't we talk about that? Thank you.
I'll try and remember the first question. In comparison with other students, there does appear to be quite a difference in the pre-COVID. There was quite a marked difference between other disciplines and engineering students. The medics in the UK fared worse, but they seem to be the only ones. I think what's changed during COVID is that perhaps has evened out, but the real difference is more, to me, in the help seeking of the student. It isn't so much that they are less well, it's they are less likely to ask for help when they need it. Our own student life services, which offer counselling and crisis support, see that they see engineering and computing students at the worst point, weeks after they should have really gone and asked for help. So apart from the shame of the poor student feeling very ill and very poorly, the pressure on student life and on academics to support at such a late stage, there's a whole load of financial implications apart from anything else. Want to look at it practically, but it does. Engineering students and actually computing students as well wait far too long before saying, actually, I've got a problem, and that affects everybody, including the student. The second question, I have to say, you're going to have to ask again because I've talked for too long on the first one.
Well, it's simply, I mean, we can talk about mental health above water and below water. And if you are ill, then why don't we also talk about when you are above water, you can get even further up, you can get even stronger.
Absolutely. So there's there's approaches that for my studies, I'm taking what they're called a salutogenic approach to my studies. So I'm looking really at wellness and how we can optimize wellness rather than illness. But there are so many models you can look at in terms of health and well-being. It's not just like one line. There's a model called a dual factor model. I'm going to bore everyone now, where you can be have a mental illness, but still have perfectly excellent mental well-being. So you can have a, say, bipolar disorder that is well managed, and actually you're fine, but you have an illness. But you could not have a mental illness and have terrible mental well-being where you never sleep and you don't exercise. And so there's, it is it's a broad spectrum to look at, and we have to be very specific about the thing that we're trying to address and fix.
Right,
Thank you very much. And I think the word salutogenic and pathogenic, salutogenic is a very interesting and important word to use much more.
Thank you, Martin, for your question.
Thank you.
I think we would like to organize a few breakout rooms so we could discuss things in more, in more detail. Yeah, we're conscious that this was a very, very short breakout session. I think we would stay for hours discussing all these things. Once again, thank you so much to all the speakers for bringing such interesting, expertise and knowledge of all the things you've been doing at your own institutions and in your research projects. Natalie, shall we wrap up?
Yeah, I think we have some slides to show, right? About the next event, maybe.
Yes, just 1 second. But in the meantime, if you have any burning issues that you would like to discuss from your, that you would like to bring from your discussion group, please feel free to share. Is it showing? Because I had some trouble here on my, okay.
Yep.
So we'll have our next SEFI at Work webinar on the 12th of October, celebrating Ada Lovelace Day. So we'll have a discussion around how to bring more women into engineering and technology education, and I'll share the link on the chat so you could register.
Joanne, did you want to ask a question? You got your hand raised.
Yeah, it was just a general one to see if there had been any sort of interest in a particular type of intervention. If we've maybe not got that far in the discussions, but it would be really interesting to see if we could do some collaborative intervention, or whether we all could do the same intervention and compare later on. That would be really interesting.
That would be a great thing. Everybody does the same thing, and then we make a meta study. That would be absolutely lovely.
Excellent, cool.
However, I'm not at university any longer, so I can't be part of it. I'm in the Ministry of Higher Education, so I can tell everybody about it.
Well, that's a good start. We'll go with that.
I really like the idea that Martin bring about, let's talk about being healthy and being even more healthy. So it's about promoting good things instead of sorting out what's going on, or having that focus on having a good mental health instead of just solving any issues. And I think that's why I'm so keen to know more about growth mindsets interventions, for example, and not only this fix the student and help the student to deal with his anxiety and depression. So what are the traits and what are the variables or attitudes, if we like, could we help our students to develop during their years at university? And I think all of you mentioned in a certain way mindset as being one of the key skills, right? And the other one that I think would be really interesting is empathy, because I tend to believe it's key to everything we want to do in diversity and inclusion, right? And how are we training engineers to be problem solvers and inclusive members of a society if they don't, first of all, recognize in themselves their issues and their needs, and then how come will they be able to recognize that those needs in others and develop solutions to address those same needs? Yeah, I'll be delighted to continue these discussions, and I think there's so many things we could do together.
Here.
All right. Thank you so much for being here today. Natalie and I are really excited with this first session. Please do join us in the next event. And if you have any questions, if you would like to be involved with the SIG, just drop us a line. It will be great to see you again and in the future.